Sony Millbrook was born on February 15, 1981, in Memphis, Tennessee, USA. She grew up surrounded by a loving family, including her mom, Christine Millbrook Bennett, 2 sisters, 3 brothers, and many relatives. Sony formed a close connection with her cousin Jenny and became well-liked during her high school years. In 1998, at just 17 years old and in the 8th grade, she met a man in his 20s named Leith Moody, with whom she soon began a relationship. Unfortunately, Leith was abusive, and his violent behavior left visible marks on Sony's body. Despite their tumultuous relationship, they had 4 children together, 3 girls and a boy named after his father. In 1999, Sony's mother noticed a bruise on her daughter's chest, which Sony tearfully admitted was caused by Leith. One of her friends also observed injuries, but Sony refused to report him. Leith was controlling and often tried to isolate her from friends and family. That same year, Sony moved into an apartment in the Fraser neighborhood of Memphis. One day, the apartment management notified her of a disturbance at her home. When she arrived, she found her apartment in disarray. Furniture slashed, clothes missing, the television destroyed, food smeared on the walls, and personal hygiene products scattered everywhere, including down the stairs. Written on the mirror in red nail polish was the message, "Kiki loves you," Kiki being a nickname. On October 31, 2000, Sony, her cousin Pamela, and Leith were at a bar called Mirage. During their time there, Leith slapped Sony and threw a drink in her face. Sony and Pamela left the bar and sat in the car, where Sony was visibly shaken. She asked Pamela to take her home before Leith arrived. Once home, Sony secured the door with locks and chains. An hour later, Leith arrived, yelling and banging on the door. Pamela managed to get him to leave only after threatening to call the police. Later that evening, Pamela received a call informing her that Sony was in the hospital. Somehow, Leith had gained entry to the house. When Sony tried to end the relationship, he retaliated by tearing her clothes and beating her severely. She ended up with bruises all over her body, a loose tooth, and even lost consciousness as Leith had choked her until she passed out. Not long after, Leith found birth control pills in Sony's apartment and assaulted her again. The next morning, Sony called Pamela asking for a ride to the hospital due to a miscarriage. By late 2008, at the age of 27, Sony was working at a Christian academy, where she was a reliable employee who always arrived on time. However, when she missed work or requested time off, it was usually for significant reasons. On one occasion, she called her employer to say she couldn't come in because her face was badly bruised, and she didn't want the children to see her like that. Her boss granted her the day off. When Sony returned a few days later, her bruises were so severe that the director allowed her to wear sunglasses inside the academy. She confided in her boss about how her boyfriend had once chased her in his car, trying to force her off the road. Leith's violence wasn't limited to Sony and their children. In April 2008, he was found parked in an SUV with a firearm, despite being prohibited from possessing one as a convicted felon. He had already served 2 years in prison for theft and another 3 for drug possession with intent to sell. Despite Sony's efforts to distance herself from him, it was nearly impossible. The situation reached a critical point on October 6, 2008. That day, Sony did not show up at the academy. At 5:00 p.m., her boss received a text message from Sony stating that her boyfriend was holding her hostage in her own home and had been beating her all day. She then provided her address. The boss called the police, and 2 officers arrived at the residence. They knocked on the door, but it was locked from the inside, and there was no response. They called the fire department, who broke down the door. When the officers entered, they saw Leith jumping out of an open window at the back of the apartment. Sony stood in a hallway, crying and unable to speak due to her distressed state. Her 4 children were with her, completing a heartbreaking scene. She was covered in bruises and scratches on her face and neck. Once she calmed down, Sony explained what had happened. She and Leith had started arguing, and he refused to let her leave the house. She informed the officers that they didn't answer the door earlier because Leith wouldn't allow her or the children near it or the windows. She mentioned that Leith had hurt one of their children by grabbing him and had prevented her from taking him to the hospital. Sony detailed that her boyfriend had been physically and verbally abusing her, even tying a baby blanket around her neck and choking her until she lost consciousness. When the police arrived, Leith threatened to suffocate her again, promising that next time he would make sure to kill her. The officers searched the area, but could not find Leith. Sony left the house with her children in her car. 3 days after this incident, she applied for a restraining order against Leith, fearing for her life and wanting to prevent any further contact with him. However, she missed the court hearing on October 23rd, and the protection order was never granted. Nearly 6 months later, on March 10, 2009, Sony was still in contact with Leith. That day, he was supposed to pick up the children for a doctor's appointment. But instead, he started a fight with Sony, accusing her of having a new boyfriend. The argument quickly escalated as he slapped her and pulled her hair. She managed to break free and ran out of the apartment, with Leith yelling death threats after her. Instead of catching her, Leith grabbed their youngest child, an infant, and drove off at high speed. A police patrol, alerted to the domestic disturbance, arrived just as Leith was fleeing. The officers attempted to stop him, but he evaded them and escaped. By early 2010, 28-year-old Sony was studying at Southeast Tennessee Community College. Her 5th child was just 9 weeks old and in fragile health, requiring her to stay home to care for him. In January, Leith, Sony, and their children moved into the Budget Lodge Motel in Memphis. The very day they moved in, their arguments were so loud that the motel staff had to intervene, as they were disturbing other guests. Peace was elusive. Their fights were constant, annoying the neighbors and the management with the noise. On January 22nd, the hotel security guard witnessed Leith in a highly agitated state. He arrived at high speed in Sony's car and began shouting at her while she stood on the second-floor balcony with the children. In the heat of the argument, he threw a bag of groceries at her. The guard approached and told him they couldn't make so much noise or throw objects, and that they needed to finish the argument inside their room. Leith simply told him to mind his own business. He locked the car and walked away, with the guard following him to a third-floor room not registered under anyone's name. Later, the guard asked Leith to hand over any hotel keys he had, and to his surprise, Leith had keys to 3 different rooms despite not being registered as a guest. The next day, the troubled couple moved with their children to room 222. That evening, the night manager asked Leith to leave. Though he complied, he soon returned, and the fights continued for a few more days until the same security guard, who had repeatedly warned them, asked Leith to leave the property for good. The receptionist tried to calm him down as he went to the parking lot, and the guard told him not to come back that night. Leith got into the car and drove away. On January 26th, Sony spoke with Pamela, confiding that many things were happening in her life and that she was staying at the motel. She expressed a desire to tell Pamela something important and said she would call if she left the motel or if her boyfriend left first. The next day started normally. At 7 a.m., Sony took her younger children to daycare and her eldest to school. Around 11 o'clock a.m., the housekeeping manager knocked on Sony's door, speaking to her through the window to inform her they needed to pay or leave. He returned several times that day. On one visit around 2:30 p.m., Leith answered the door. The room was dark. Leith told the manager that his mother was on her way to bring the money. Later, the hotel security guard checked room 222 and found it empty. Children's clothes, bags, and various items were scattered on the floor in one of the beds, while the other bed was neatly made. That same day, January 27th, Sony failed to pick up her eldest daughter on time. The school secretary called Christine, the child's maternal grandmother, to come and get her. Christine tried calling Sony but received no answer. Around 6 o'clock p.m., Christine discovered that her other grandchildren were still at daycare. Worried by the lack of response, she asked her husband to pick up the younger children from daycare while she went to the school, convinced something was wrong. They contacted the police, who came to the house around 10:30 p.m. and filed a missing persons report. On January 28th, the housekeeping manager entered the now empty room 222 again. This time, he began cataloging and tagging the belongings left behind by the tenants who seemingly fled to avoid paying their bill. The room contained piles of clothes and a large garbage bag, which were taken to the storage area. Once the room was emptied, it was cleaned and made available for new guests. The next occupants were James and Rhonda Sargent, who moved in on January 29th. The new tenants noticed a foul odor and tried to mask it with incense, but it wasn't enough. They also noticed that the previous occupants had attempted to do the same, as they found scented tissues in the tiles and ceiling vents. The smell was particularly strong when someone sat on the bed. On January 29th, officers from the Memphis Police Department's Missing Persons Unit visited the hotel to inquire about Soni's whereabouts, as it was the last place she had been seen. However, they did not enter room 222. Leith was found on February 2nd around 7:00 p.m. inside Soni's car parked at a shopping center. He was arrested for vehicle theft and held in police custody for 48 hours. That night, he was questioned about Soni's disappearance. He claimed the last time he saw her was on January 26th. He explained that they met around 7 a.m. in the hotel parking lot after she returned from dropping off the children at school. They went into the room, were intimate, and then went back outside. He took Soni's car keys and left the hotel. Leith stated that Soni planned to use her social benefits and a school loan to buy a new car, so it wasn't a problem if he kept hers. He claimed he had been living in the car since January 26th. Investigators, however, discovered that he had actually been staying at another hotel. Additionally, it was unlikely he spent nights in the car due to the snow during that period. On February 3rd, a debit card with Soni's name and several recent purchase receipts were found inside the car. That same day, the police examined the clothes placed in storage at the hotel, hoping to find DNA or other evidence, but came up empty-handed. Adding to their frustrations, Leith had to be released due to insufficient evidence linking him to Soni's disappearance. Meanwhile, Soni's cousin and her mother endured the painful task of going to the hotel to collect Soni's belongings. Her cousin had a terrible premonition, but found nothing to support her feelings. On February 4th, the police visited Moody's uncle's house and found a DVD player from the hotel room in Soni's wallet. Moody had given these items to his cousin. The cousin told the police that Leith had borrowed the DVD player on January 24th, supposedly to watch a movie, and was driving a red car that day. A few days later, the cousin saw Leith again and asked why he hadn't picked up the children on January 27th. But Leith avoided the question. When he inquired about Soni's whereabouts, Leith left the DVD player and wallet in a bag and left the house. As the days passed, James and Rhonda Sargent requested to be moved from room 222 due to the persistent bad odor. With no other rooms available, they moved to another hotel. Subsequent guests in room 222 also complained about the foul smell. Despite numerous cleanings and a carpet wash in early February, the odor persisted, only slightly reduced for a few days. Soni's family, especially her children, were deeply affected by her absence. Their only hope was for Soni's safe return. On February 4th, homicide detectives visited the hotel. By then, the room had been occupied and cleaned at least 3 times. The detectives did not enter the room, but asked the staff if they noticed anything unusual. All responded negatively. On February 7th, James and Rhonda returned to the hotel, changing rooms 3 times, including spending one night in room 222. The Sargents informed the management that the room still reeked of the unpleasant odor. In March, a more thorough cleaning was carried out, which included the carpets, bedding, bathroom curtains, and window drapes. To everyone's dismay, the smell not only persisted but intensified. The manager discussed the issue with the security guard. During their conversation, they recalled that the former tenant Sony had disappeared at the end of January. The guard remembered the events from that time and suggested that the manager inspect room 222 for blood or cleaning agents. 10 minutes later, the manager returned and asked the guard to accompany him. What they discovered was shocking. The two men entered the room where the manager had removed the mattress from one of the beds, leaving only the frame. The lower part of the bed frame had a sort of enclosure that prevented using the space underneath as an unsightly storage area. However, lifting the box spring revealed a large empty space where anything could be hidden from view. Looking through the solid edges of the frame, they saw something unimaginable: a decomposing body. They called the police, who arrived at the scene shortly after. The bed frame had marks all over it, and there were two broken wooden areas near the head of the bed. Was a towel and a cloth bag between the legs of the body, which was wearing a shirt but was naked from the waist down. The forensic team's autopsy determined that the cause of death was strangulation with a coaxial cable. The cable was wrapped around the neck, went under one arm, around the chest, and ended at the back. The forensic examiner concluded that it would have taken at least 2 to 3 minutes of continuous pressure to cause death. DNA samples matched Sony's genetic profile and female markers. Male genetic material was also found on 5 parts of the cable. The main hypothesis was that Sony had already been dead when she was reported missing, and that Leith had used the coaxial cable from the DVD player he had borrowed from his cousin, indicating premeditation. Leith was found and detained by the police shortly after, not for the discovery of Sony's body, but on a different charge: possessing a firearm despite a prior felony conviction. Nonetheless, at the time of his arrest, he was considered a person of interest since he was the last person seen with Sony alive. Additionally, he was again in Sony's car when he was arrested and sent to the detention facility in Mason. On March 18th, the police announced an internal investigation to determine how the case had unfolded so strangely. They stated that the family deserved answers and explained that while the officers were eager to resolve the case, they had pursued a different path that led away from the room. They also stated that they had never encountered anything like this, noting that the discovery surpassed fiction and highlighted the drama of domestic violence. He regretted that the room had been cleaned and rented multiple times since Sony's death, complicating the police's evidence collection efforts. This explanation was met with skepticism. Shortly after, Rhonda, one of the first tenants to stay in the room where Sony's body was found, spoke to the media. She mentioned that if the officers had asked to enter the room during their January visit, they would have been allowed. She reasoned that, unlike her and her husband, the officers should have recognized the smell of a decomposing body and found Sony much earlier. Finally, the time came to give Sony a loving and dignified farewell. Her funeral was held on March 24th. Sony's children were placed under the care of her sister and her husband. By April 1st, they were making efforts to obtain legal guardianship of the children. She stated that while the children were the primary victims, the lives of everyone in the family were disrupted by the tragic loss. She expressed that while she couldn't bring her sister back, she was determined to care for Sony's children, ensuring they had food, clothing, and toys, and keeping them together as a family. Sony had been a beneficiary of a social program that periodically credited funds to a card for grocery purchases. The card had been loaded shortly before the crime as part of a tax refund on her income. The police tracked the movements of this card, which was found in Leith's possession. This effort proved successful, revealing that the card had been used on February 1st, 4 days after Sony's disappearance, at a convenience store. Sony usually visited the store on the 1st of each month to withdraw cash, using her electronic benefit transfer card. Officers went to the store and asked the owner for access to the footage from their 16 security cameras. On the morning of February 1st at 11:38, the surveillance system captured a man in yellow using Sony's card to buy a bottle of orange juice, withdraw some cash, and purchase a cigar. After making the purchases, he returned to a car driven by another person. With all the evidence against him, the trial for Leith began in the first week of February 2014, over 4 years after the crime. By then, the Budget Lodge Hotel had closed. Leith pleaded not guilty while the prosecutor described the situation as a very ugly and tragic end to a tumultuous relationship. In contrast, the defense attorney emphasized the lack of conclusive evidence, including witnesses or material proof. He argued that there was no evidence of premeditation, only the prosecution's speculations. He pointed out that the police had found a fingerprint on the bed frame that did not match Leith's. He suggested that someone else might have killed Sony as she had been involved with other men over the years. He insisted that his client had never been arrested for domestic violence against her. Additionally, he revealed something that had not been public knowledge. Sony had moved in with Leith again because she had to leave a relative's house due to a rat infestation. On February 6th, the video showing Leith using Sony's prepaid card 4 days after her death was presented in court. The defense claimed his calm demeanor during the transaction indicated innocence, while the prosecution saw it as evidence of a cold-blooded and ruthless man unbothered by the crime he had allegedly committed. On February 7, 2014, he was found guilty of first-degree murder and was automatically sentenced to life in prison. On February 10th, he appealed the sentence, arguing that the court had erred in considering past domestic violence acts and that the evidence was insufficient. On July 7, 2015, the Tennessee Court of Criminal Appeals upheld the conviction, confirming the sentences.